today we're going to be looking at how to answer non-verbal reasoning questions. Now, the 11 plus exams are used for selection purposes. What this means is that grammar schools and independent schools admit children based upon their performance in the 11 plus. That's part of their selection purposes. Usually the examinations take place in the autumn term of year 6, and schools, they use the results of these 11 plus examinations to decide who to offer a place to. Okay, now the 11 plus examinations can be made up of several different components. It is really important that you find out what the selection process is for the school that you are interested in. So if you click in the description below, in there I've got a link to my website which will give you a full list of independent and grammar schools, and it's really important that you go in and check exactly which tests and exactly which examinations they use in order to offer a place to your child or to you. So there's 4 components that this could be made up of. You've got mathematics here, or it could have an English component that's usually made up of comprehension and a writing task. You could have verbal reasoning being assessed, and as we'll talk about in this video, it could be non-verbal reasoning. So it's really important that you find out what the school is looking for so that you can prepare appropriately for that. So let's have a look. Now, non-verbal reasoning is made up of several different key question types. So often you have questions that may involve finding out what the missing shape is in a sequence, or identifying what the shapes are. It could involve rotating shapes. Many questions include cracking a code, so there could be coded shapes, which really is looking at how good the child is with their logical thinking and their reasoning. And then often it can involve patterns which are with 2D shapes, but also there are questions that involve 3D shapes. In this video we'll be looking at the 2D shape questions. So let's just get into it now and have a look at an example. So in this question, it's asking you to find the figure in each row most unlike the other figures. So this is a question that I've lifted from this particular skill that they're trying to assess in the child. So what this question's asking you to do is to basically spot the odd one out. Which shape doesn't fit the pattern of the other shape, or which figure doesn't fit the pattern of the other figures. So you're looking for something that is standing out to be different from all the others. Now, in order to approach this type of question, you really have to be systematic. Okay, so we have here a little reminder of, and I've named it snaps. So as you're looking at a question, think about what is the shape in these figures, or what are the sizes of the figures. What about the number? So the number could vary, the number of shapes could vary, or lines, or whatever the figure may happen to be. What is the angle or the direction that the shape or line or pattern is going in? What is the position of the shapes within each figure? And is there a difference in shading? So so let's have a look at these figures. So you can see each shape has an outline, and each outline is a square, apart from this shape here. This outline is a circle. So it possibly could be this shape, because straight away I can see the shape is different around the outside for that particular shape. If we look at the other features, every single figure has a shape within it. However, A, B, C and E have circles, and D actually has a square. So there's 2 differences there with D. So D is really looking like the most probable answer. The angle and direction, well, they all the figures are at the same angle, so it's not that. Position, well, all the shapes within each figure is in the middle of the shape, so the position isn't a feature that shows any real difference. The shading is all consistent, so you've got a white shading around the outside of the shape within is black. Okay, so that's the same, because when you approach these questions you're thinking, okay, what is the same and what is different? Another difference I can see is that the sizing of the shapes vary within each figure. On balance, I can see that figure D shows the most differences out of the others. Okay, it's the most unlike figure compared to the others.
Okay, let's look at the next question. Find which one of the 5 squares completes the sequence on the left. So let's look at some greater detail at the sequence. So as you can see, we've got 4 arrows which are of equal size. They all have the same shading and they are rotating. So you can see that they're changing position. Each step of the sequence is in a different position. So here we've got an arrow that's pointing southeast. This arrow is pointing south. This arrow is pointing southwest. And this arrow is pointing west. So they're sort of rotating in a clockwise direction. So if we have a look at our options here, straight away I can eliminate option A and option B, because yes, they're the same size and yes, they're rotating, but the shading is different. And you're not all of a sudden going to have a random colour pop up at the last step of the sequence. So I'm going to go ahead and eliminate option A and option B. I don't think those are likely answers. Equally, if we look at option E, that arrow is much smaller. Not only is the shading different, but it's much smaller as well. So I don't think it's option E. So that leaves option C and D. So I need to look at which arrow is following the same sequence of change of direction. And as we've already said, it's moving in a clockwise position. So really we ought to have the next arrow pointing northwest, which is option D. Okay, let's look at the next question. It says, find the figure on the right which is most like the 2 figures on the left. So we need to have a look at these figures and see what they have in common, because remember, using the mnemonic snaps, we are looking at what is the same and what is different. So you can see we've got both of these have got squares at the top corner, the top left corner here, and then they've got 2 other shapes. The shapes are different with each one, but they're organized in a diagonal direction. Okay, so if we look at each one of the options, straight away I can see B also has a square at the top left corner, so that looks like a strong contender, but I'm not going to jump to any conclusions. I'm going to look through and check the other ones as well. So if we look at the number, we can see that each step of the sequence has 3, so I can eliminate option C and E because these have 2, so it's not likely to be that. Each step of the sequence has different shapes. This doesn't. This is all identical, 3 identical circles, so it's not going to be A. So that leaves B and D. I can eliminate D because it doesn't have the square there. I'm going to double check that B is right because it has a square and it has 2 identical shapes that complete the diagonal. So it's option B. Okay, let's look at the next question. find which one of the 5 squares on the right should fill the missing square in the grid. So let's have a look, because the shape is being transformed in 2 different ways here. We have this shape here, and in the next section we can see that it has changed direction, but not only that, the border has become thicker than the previous shape. So there's 2 changes, directions and the border. So I would expect my next shape to do the same thing if it was to follow the same pattern. So we've got an arrow here with a thin border. I would expect it to change direction to this northeast direction, and I'd expect the border to be bigger as well, thicker as well. So let's have a look at the options. I can see straight away that option B is also an arrow, and also that it's got a thick border. So I'm going to say I think it's B, but I'm going to check the others just to make sure I haven't missed anything out. So I can eliminate option A and E because actually they're both suddenly turning black in the center, and also it's a lot smaller than the original shape, so it can't be that. C is the right shape, but the direction is incorrect. It's pointing the wrong way. I wanted it to point northeast. In fact, it's pointing west, so that's not right. And finally, option D, even though it is the right shape and the border is correct, it's gone to an inconsistent direction, so it can't be option D. So I'm going to say it's option B, and that is the correct answer. Okay, let's look at the next question. So in this question, we are finding the figure on the right-hand side, which is most like the others. So let's look at what these have in common using snaps, because remember with these questions, we're looking at what is the same and what is different. Okay, so let's have a look. So we can see we've got 3 circles here. All the circles have a blue border. They all have shading in the background with vertical stripes, and each shape has a white shape with a black border in its center. The shapes are different, but what is the same is that they have a white center and a black border. So we're going to have a look and see which shapes have things in common with these shapes, or are most like these different figures. Okay, so let's have a look. So option A, we can see, yes, it has a blue circle, but if we look at the shading is different. Instead of it being vertical, the shading is horizontal, and that's not consistent with what we're looking for, so we're going to get rid of that. With option B, we've got a blue circle, but there's no shading. Instead of shading being around the central shape, it's actually inside the central shape, which is different, so I don't think it's that one either. So you look at option C, yes, it's got a blue circle. The shading, however, is diagonal opposed to vertical, so I don't think it's that one. Option D, we can see it's got a blue circle, it has vertical stripes, it has a white shape with a black border, so that actually has quite a great deal in common with these 3 figures. So if I look at option E, just to be doubly sure, before I select D, I can see that is wrong because it's got a white background and the central shape has horizontal shading, so that's not it. So it's option D. At this point, before we move on to the next question, I'd just like to draw your attention to my website. It's got lots of free resources and advice as to how to support your child in the 11 plus, so please do click on the link. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Okay, let's move on to the next question. It says, find the figure in each row that is most unlike the other figures. So here we've got 5 different figures here, and we're going to use snaps to look at what is the same and what is different. So we can see they've all got lines, That's all the same. They all have triangles at the end. That's all the same. But there are also differences. So we can see this one has a dotted line, as does C and D. So because that's 3 out of the 5, that's not going to be my determining factor to find which one is the odd one out, which is what this question is asking us to do. Finding the figure that is the most unlike the others is finding the odd one out. Also, there's a difference in the triangles. These two triangles are smaller, and also some of the triangles are white and some of the triangles are black. Again, because there's not one of these figures that only have this feature, that's not going to help me. So I've looked at the shape and the size, I've looked at the number, I've looked at the position of the triangles and the shading of the triangles. So now I'm going to look at angle and direction. Which way are they facing? Maybe that's going to help me to find which figure is the odd one out. So let's start a look at this. This is facing clockwise. So if I was to draw a line to show the direction that this triangle is facing, if it was going around like the hands of the clock, it's going in a clockwise direction. Let's see if this one follows the same rule. Yes, it does. It's following a clockwise direction. Let's look at option C. Now this one is actually going the opposite way. It's facing the opposite direction. This one is going anti-clockwise. So let's see what D and E are doing. Option D is going around in a clockwise direction. And option E is also going in a clockwise direction. So that means option C is the only figure which has a direction going anti-clockwise. So that is my odd one out. That is my figure that is most unlike the other figures. So the answer is option C. Let's have a look at the next question. So this question says, find which one of the 5 squares completes the sequence. So we're looking at a sequence here of different patterns. We're going to use the mnemonic snaps to help us to work out this answer. So remember, when we look at these questions, we're thinking what is the same and what is different. So I'm going to have a look at what these shapes have that in common. Well, we have a variety of different shapes in each step. Some have squares, stars, triangles and circles, but the shapes are not appearing in every single step of the sequence. So I need to look at how they are linked together. So if I look at my first step of the sequence, I can see that this has 2 squares that are diagonal to one another. So we've got a square here and we've got a square here. So I'm going to see if this pattern repeats itself anywhere, whether there's 2 shapes that are diagonal to each other. So I can see here in my next step that also the next step of this sequence has 2 identical shapes diagonal to one another in the same way. And in the next step, there are also 2 other shapes that are diagonal to one another, and also in my next step. So what that tells me is I'm looking for 2 shapes that are going to be identical to each other at a diagonal. So I can eliminate option A because option A doesn't have 2 identical shapes that are diagonal to one another in the same way. So it's not likely to be option A. Now let's look at some other differences because I need to find some other links to eliminate because I've got 4 options still. Now I can see all of my shapes in the sequence are white with a black border, so it can't be option C because all of a sudden in option C, even though it has 2 diagonal squares, all of a sudden it has a black shape, so it's not going to be that one. So let's have a look at other similarities. So if we have a look here, I can see that there's a triangle on the bottom left of the square, and then in the next step there's a triangle on the top right of the next square. So let me see if that pattern repeats itself. So yes, I've got a square here, so I would expect if it follows the same pattern as before, I would expect this to appear again at the top right, and it does. Let's see if the circle follows the same rule. The circle is there at the bottom left, and it is also at the top right. So if it follows this rule for the next step of the sequence, I should see a star in the top right corner in my one. And I can see here, I've got that here in option D, that the star is in the top right corner. So I can eliminate option B because it doesn't have a star, and option E because it doesn't have a star. So that means my answer must be option D, because that is the only figure that follows the pattern. Just select the right tool. There we go, that's the right answer. Okay, let's clear the slate so we can see the question. So the next question says, use the codes for the shapes on the left to help you work out the code for the shape on the right. So in this type of question, we have got shapes that are representing letters, and you've got to work out what each shape represents, or what each pattern represents. So we're going to continue to use the mnemonic snaps. So we're looking at the shape, the size, the number of things that appear, the angle and direction, the position and the shading, if it's applicable. So here in our figure here, we've got a circle with a dotted line and a grey square. We've got a circle with a solid line and a grey square, and we've got a circle with a dotted line again, but this time with a white square. So what we're looking for is what is similar and what is different, so we can work out what each thing is worth. So if we look here we both have the letter F for both figures. So we need to look at what is the same with both figures, because that must represent F. So we can see for both of those figures we've got the dotted line, so that we can reason from that that the dotted line must mean F. So dotted line represents F. If I look at a different similarity, we can see here both of these figures have a code for V. So we're looking at what is the same with these two figures. Well, we already know the dotted line represents F, so then I can deduce from that that the letter V must be represented by this grey square, because they both have the grey square and they both have V. So I'm going to say that the grey square is representing V. So we've left now with two other things to identify, because in our figure we're looking for what the solid line with the circle represents. So it must be G. It must be G, so it could be either A or could either be D. And the white square must be W, because that's the only option left. So the white square is W. So that means my correct answer is A.